Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get into the weeds on complex topics, pull out the key bits, and hopefully make it all clear, maybe even a little fun. Today, we're diving into something pretty fascinating and, yeah, often quite contentious: the New World Translation of the Bible. Now, we're not just sharing opinions here. We're actually digging into a specific research study, one called New World Translation, a scholarly defense. Our mission really is to unpack this for you. Is the NWT, the Bible used by Jehovah's Witnesses, a legit scholarly translation? Or, like critics often say, is it basically shaped, maybe even biased, by its own specific doctrines? We want to see what this research actually says.
Yeah, it's a real deep dive, right? Because this study, it doesn't just skim the surface. It looks hard at the manuscripts the NWT used, its linguistic accuracy, the historical background, really trying to get past the usual arguments and look at the evidence.
And there are definitely arguments. The NWT generates a lot of talk, right? I mean, the first thing most people notice is probably Jehovah showing up in the New Testament hundreds of times, where most Bibles just say, Lord. Then you've got specific verses, like John 1.1 or Colossians 1.1. The NWT reads them in a way that seems to, challenge the traditional view of Jesus' divinity. Plus, certain passages are just gone or footnoted, like the end of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16.920. Lots of translations have it. The NWT flags it. So the big question hanging over all this, the one we're tackling today, is, are these changes backed up by solid textual scholarship? Or are they maybe theological tweaks to fit a doctrine? Let's find out. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Before we get into the controversies, what's the actual textual basis? Like, what ancient writings are they even working from?
Right. Well, this is pretty crucial. For the Old Testament, the NWT primarily relies on the Biblia Hebraica Stikartensia. That's basically the standard scholarly edition of the Hebrew Masoretic text today. They even look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, for insights, especially on how YHWH, the divine name, might have been pronounced. And for the New Testament, they're using well-respected Greek texts, things like the Westcott and Hort texts from back in 1881, but also the modern critical editions, the Nessie-Allen and the UBS texts. These are like the go-to sources for scholars trying to reconstruct the earliest possible Greek text. Pretty standard stuff, actually.
Okay, so they're using standard scholarly texts as their base.
Exactly. And that choice of manuscripts is key. It directly explains some of those omissions you mentioned, especially if you compare it to something like the King James Version. So passages like the long ending of Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, or that story in John about the woman caught in adultery, John 7.53 to 8.11. The NWT flags these or puts them in footnotes because, they just aren't found in the really early important manuscripts, like the Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus from the 4th century. They're missing there. Yeah. Same goes for 1 John 5, verses 7 and 8, the bit about the 3 heavenly witnesses. That doesn't show up in any Greek manuscripts before the 15th century.
Wow. Okay, so the study is basically saying the NWT's foundation is built on older, maybe even more reliable manuscripts than the Textus Receptus, which the King James Version used. That's actually a pretty significant point, isn't it? It sort of reframes the whole debate about omissions.
It does. It suggests their starting point is aligned with modern textual criticism, even if the conclusions they draw are debated.
Right. It makes you realize just how much textual history and, frankly, human choices go into the Bible you hold in your hand. Okay, let's move on. Let's tackle that really distinctive feature, Jehovah in the New Testament. Most Bibles have Lord. How does the study justify putting Jehovah back in?
Okay, yeah, this is probably the most visible change. The study offers both historical and linguistic reasons. First, think about the context.
Okay.
Jesus, the apostles, they were Jewish. They constantly quoted the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, where God's personal name, YHWH, appeared almost 7,000 times. So it's very plausible, the study argues, that early Jewish Christians, maybe groups like the Ebionites, would have kept using the divine name. It was central to their heritage.
Okay, so the Jewish context is important.
Definitely. And then there's the evidence from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. This is really interesting. Some very early fragments of the Septuagint, discovered relatively recently, like Papyrus Fold 266, actually have the divine name YHWH written right into the Greek text in Hebrew letters. Later copies replace it with kurios, the Greek word for Lord. But the early evidence suggests the name was there originally, even in the Greek translation Jews were using.
So the name might have been removed later on.
That's the implication. So when the NWT translators see a New Testament quote from an Old Testament passage that originally used YHWH, they argue they're restoring the name, not inserting something new. Take Matthew 4, pointing to Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6.13. The NWT says, "It is Jehovah your God you must worship," because Deuteronomy used YHWH. Most other Bibles say the Lord, which, obscures that direct quote and the divine name's presence in the original source text.
So the study sees this as historically plausible, a restoration based on textual evidence and context, not just like a whim.
Essentially, yes. They frame it as trying to be faithful to the original context and the likely practice of early Jewish believers.
That definitely challenges the simple "they just added it" criticism. It forces you to think about scribal habits and how the name might have been treated over time. Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's get into some of those specific verses that always spark debate. How does the study handle the grammar in places like John 1.1?
Right, John 1.1, probably the most famous example. The NWT says, "and the Word was a God." Most translations say, "and the Word was God." The Greek is kai theos on ho logos. The key point the study focuses on is that the word theos, God before logos word, doesn't have the definite article, the. It's anarthrous.
Anarthrous. Okay, and what does that mean grammatically?
Well, that's the crux of the debate. Does the lack of the article mean the word had the quality of being divine? So the word was divine. That's one view. Or does it make theos indefinite, like a god? Similar to how Herod is called a god, theos, in Acts 12.22, without meaning he's the almighty God. The study also points to an early Coptic translation, the Sahidic version from around the 3rd century, which uses a word that seems to mean a god or divine, not necessarily the supreme God. So the study's conclusion, the NWT rendering a god is linguistically possible, defensible based on the grammar, even if it's not the traditional interpretation.
Linguistically defensible. Okay. What about Colossians 1.1's teen? The NWT adds the word other. All other things were created.
Yeah, that's another big one. Colossians 1.1 says Christ created all things, panta in Greek. Yeah. The NWT inserts other by means of him, all other things were created. Now, the word other isn't actually in the Greek text. The study acknowledges that.
So why add it?
The justification given is logical, or perhaps theological. They argue that if Christ created all things, and he himself is part of creation, as Jehovah's Witnesses believe God's first creation, then he couldn't have created himself. So all things must implicitly mean all other things, everything besides Christ himself. It makes the passage fit their understanding of Christ's nature as created, not co-eternal God.
So it's an interpretive addition based on their theology, even though the word itself isn't there.
Correct. The study presents it as a clarification consistent with their Christology, though critics obviously see it as adding to the text to support doctrine.
Okay, one more tricky one, Hebrews 1.8.
Hebrews 1.8. Traditionally read as God the Father addressing the Son. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, directly calling Jesus God. The NWT offers a very different reading. God is your throne forever and ever. Here, God isn't being addressed. God is the throne, the source of the Son's authority.
God is your throne. That sounds quite different. Is that grammatically possible?
Grammatically, the study says it's, well, technically possible, but extremely rare for Greek sentence structure to work that way in this kind of context. It's an unusual rendering. And crucially, the scholarly pushback highlighted in the study is strong here. There's basically no support from early manuscripts or translations for reading the verse this way. It seems like a forced interpretation.
So of the examples we've looked at, this one seems the weakest in terms of textual support.
According to the study's own analysis, yes. While they argue it's not grammatically impossible, it lacks the kind of manuscript or strong linguistic backing seen for, say, John 1.1.
This really digs into that core question, doesn't it? When does careful grammatical consideration tip over into potential bias? Or is it just a different, albeit minority, interpretive path? So the study tackles this head on, right? Does the NWT insert theology? How does it really compare to mainstream translations on neutrality?
It does. And this is where you see the theological commitments really come into focus. Philippians 2.6 is a prime example. Most translations say something like Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held onto. The NWT, however, reads, he gave no consideration to a seizure, namely that he should be equal to God, or later revision, did not even consider trying to be equal to God.
That's a significant difference in meaning.
It is. The NWT rendering strongly implies Jesus never possessed equality with God and didn't even aspire to it, which aligns perfectly with JW doctrine, but contrasts sharply with the traditional view that he had equality but chose not to exploit it.
So the translation choice directly supports their theological position.
Exactly. And you see similar patterns elsewhere. John 8.58, Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I have been, in the NWT. Compare that to the NIV or others. Before Abraham was born, I am. Many see I am as a deliberate echo of God's name in Exodus 3.12, a claim to divinity. The NWT's I have been avoids that implication.
Right, it downplays the potential divine claim.
Or Acts 20.28, talking about the church purchased with blood. NIV says God bought it with his own blood. NWT says God bought it with the blood of his own son. Again, the NWT rendering avoids attributing the shedding of blood directly to God, fitting their view of Jesus as the Son, distinct from the Father.
So the study acknowledges this pattern.
Yes, the study concludes that the NWT consistently steers clear of language that supports the Trinity. And it suggests that sometimes achieving this avoidance involves, let's say, pushing the boundaries of Greek grammar or opting for less common interpretations.
Okay, so there's a definite theological angle acknowledged by the study itself. Given all this, what kind of reception has the NWT actually received from scholars outside the Jehovah's Witnesses? It sounds like opinions would be strong.
Oh, absolutely. Strong and very divided. It's quite polarized, which the study also reflects. On the one hand, you find some surprising support, or at least qualified praise, from scholars who aren't JWs. Jason Bedone, for instance, wrote a book called Truth in Translation. He compared 9 major English Bibles on key controversial passages, and he actually concluded the NWT was the most accurate of the bunch quite often. That raised some eyebrows.
Most accurate. Wow. Anyone else?
There's also Benjamin Kedar, a respected Hebrew scholar from Israel. He commented back in the 80s that he found the NWT to be an honest endeavor that reflected a solid understanding of the original languages.
Honest endeavor. High praise. But there must be critics, too.
Oh, yes. Very prominent critics. Bruce Metzger, who was basically a giant in New Testament textual criticism at Princeton, was quite blunt. He specifically called the NWT's rendering of John 1.1 a dreadful, pernicious, even reprehensible mistranslation. Strong words.
Definitely strong words.
And then you have scholars like Daniel B. Wallace from Dallas Theological Seminary, a well-known Greek grammarian. He argues quite forcefully that the NWT often twists the grammar of the Greek to make it conform to Jehovah's Witness doctrine.
So a real split. Some see rigor and accuracy, at least in places. Others see doctrinal manipulation overriding sound translation principles.
That's precisely. It really depends on which passages you focus on and what criteria you prioritize: adherence to early manuscripts, grammatical likelihood, or theological consistency.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. If we connect the NWT's approach, particularly its non-Trinitarian stance, to the bigger sweep of Christian history, how does the study position it? Does it align with how early Christians thought?
This is another really interesting angle the study explores. It argues that the NWT's emphasis on God's singularity and Jesus' distinct subordinate role actually resonates with some theological streams before the doctrine of the Trinity was fully codified at councils like Nicaea in 325 AD. For example, it points to sages like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. He sometimes referred to Jesus using terms like angel, or as distinct from the unbegotten God. Or Tertullian, around the turn of the 3rd century. He's actually credited with coining the Latin term Trinitas, Trinity, but even his understanding often portrayed the Son as subordinate to the Father in substance or origin.
So the idea is that early views were more diverse, less uniformly Trinitarian than we might assume.
That's the argument. The study emphasizes that strict Jewish monotheism was the absolute bedrock for the first believers. Deuteronomy 6.4, Hear, O Israel, Jehovah our God is one Jehovah, was paramount. The concept of a triune God simply wasn't part of first-century Jewish belief. So the study suggests the NWT, by resisting later Trinitarian formulations, might actually reflect certain aspects of that very early pre-council theological landscape.
That's a provocative thought, positioning the NWT not just as a modern sectarian translation, but as potentially echoing some very early, albeit non-mainstream today, Christian viewpoints.
Exactly. It challenges the narrative that Trinitarianism was the only orthodox view right from the start.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, diving deep into this study. New World Translation, a scholarly defense. So after all that analysis, what's the bottom line? How does the study ultimately assess the NWT?
Well, summarizing the study's findings, it really presents a balanced picture, highlighting both strengths and weaknesses. On the plus side, it gives the NWT credit for using a strong foundation of older, generally more reliable manuscripts, especially compared to something like the KJV. It also views the restoration of Jehovah in the New Testament as having a plausible historical and linguistic basis, connecting NT quotes to their OT source. And it concludes that some of those controversial renderings, like John 1.1 to God, are grammatically defensible, even if they represent a minority scholarly view.
Okay, those are the strengths noted. What about the weaknesses?
On the other side, the study acknowledges weaknesses. That Hebrews 1.8 rendering God is your throne is seen as having very little manuscript or grammatical support. It's identified as a particularly problematic translation. And the insertion of the word other in Colossians 1.16 is clearly noted as an addition to the original Greek text, driven by theological interpretation rather than the text itself.
Right. So balancing those strengths and weaknesses, what's the study's final verdict? False translation, legitimate scholarship, somewhere in between.
The study steers clear of calling it simply false or entirely illegitimate. Instead, it characterizes the NWT as, and this is their term, a theologically conservative translation. What that means is, while it generally uses sound scholarly texts as its base, when it comes to passages that are ambiguous or touch on core Jehovah's Witness doctrines, especially concerning the Trinity and the nature of Christ, it consistently chooses the interpretation that aligns with that specific theology. So not necessarily dishonest, but certainly shaped by its doctrinal commitments in key places.
Theologically conservative, that's a nuanced way to put it. It acknowledges the scholarship involved, but also the clear doctrinal influence. So considering all of this, the manuscript evidence, the tricky grammar, the historical context, the scholarly debates, and this study's assessment, it leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. How might really understanding the history, the textual choices, and the potential biases behind any translation, whether it's the NWT or the KJV or the NIV, change how you read and interpret that text? What does this deep dive into one specific translation reveal about the bigger, ongoing, and often very human journey of trying to understand sacred writings across centuries and languages?